Welcome to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I am going to be talking about the main takeaways from All Core Developers Execution Call number 197, ACDE 197. We are going to be talking about updates to the Ethereum Pectra upgrade. There is more consensus on what the scope of Pectra should be, so that is a good thing. We'll talk about that. And there are some interesting conversations happening around home staking on Ethereum and the viability of home staking with further improvements to data availability on Ethereum. So we will get into the conversation happening around home staking as well as talk about the solidifying scope of the Pectra upgrade on today's episode. Before we start, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. I will start with a summary of the main takeaways from the call from ACDE 197. The first is that there is more consensus about making Pectra, the upcoming Ethereum upgrade, limited in scope to just the 8 EIPs that are live on Pectra Devnet 3 right now. This was an idea that was brought up on the last call. It generated quite a bit of disagreement, quite a bit of pushback from developers. On the latest call on ACDE 197, there was more consensus for it. And it, as I kind of mentioned on the last episode, although it was a decision that seemed to have already been made even before the start of the last call that happened, ACDC 142, I will say that there was more agreement, I think, on ACDE 197 to limit the scope of Pectra to these initial set of 8 EIPs instead of moving forward with the full list of 20 EIPs or even more that was originally slated for the Pectra upgrade. So developers are moving ahead with the 8 EIPs. One of the remaining questions related to Pectra scope is whether developers should add a bundle of 4 EIPs to Pectra. These 4, I'm going to go into what each of them are. They're all related to improving Ethereum's data availability capacity. Because PeerDAS is now no longer going to be included in Pectra, developers discussed making some minor changes, some simpler upgrades to Ethereum's data availability to ensure that the cost for rollups to operate on Ethereum, for Ethereum scalability as a DA layer continues to improve. It's almost one of the comments that was shared by a developer on the call. He was saying that it's basically about guaranteeing and ensuring that the future of rollups on Ethereum, giving some assurance to rollups that indeed this is a priority for Ethereum developers, that for rollup teams that are operating on Ethereum, that rollups remain like a high priority. And to show that, to kind of emphasize that this is the roadmap for Ethereum, including even a minor improvement to DA in the most immediate upgrade is something that developers should prioritize. So it's more or less finalized. We know that Pectra is going to be the 8 EIPs, the max EB, the execution layer, triggerable withdrawals, a couple other changes, the attestation refactory. We've talked about these EIPs on the show before. It's going to be those 8 EIPs, and then potentially the inclusion of the blob, the DA-related EIPs. There wasn't any mention of the SSC EIPs. We've also talked quite a bit about updates to Ethereum's data serialization format on the execution layer and some forward-compatible structures that could be introduced on the consensus layer to really ensure that the roadmap for SSC requires as minimal changes as possible from smart contract developers, particularly staking pools on Ethereum. But there really wasn't any discussion on SSC on the latest call. So I think from my perspective, there is a very low chance of SSC-related EIPs getting into Pectra. It seems as though from the latest call, developers are really only considering the inclusion of the 4 DA-related ones on top of the 8 that has already been finalized. As for the scope of the next Ethereum hard fork update, it will officially be called Fusaka. For a while, for just the past week, we were talking about Pectra 1, Pectra 2, Pectra A, Pectra B. We are confirmed that the next upgrade after Pectra will indeed inherit the name Fusaka. And for Fusaka, the chair of the call, the moderator of the call, Tim, he shared that indeed PeerDAS and EOF are slated for the next upgrade after Pectra. There may be other code changes that are added on top of EOF and PeerDAS in Fusaka. However, Tim really emphasize that developers should not start including more EIPs into Fusaka until the implementation for PeerDAS and EOF are finalized, are more or less finished, and developers are ready to write more code for other EIPs. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Almost seems like common sense to me. This is true. Developers should not add more until they're able to confirm that they have implemented all that they've already committed to. So that's a little bit of information about Fusaka. And then for the upgrade thereafter, because as our Infinite Jungle listeners should remember, Fusaka was initially slated for Verkle. Verkle was the upgrade that was supposed to headline Fusaka, but because Pectra became so big and developers decided they want to split it, now Verkle is going to be delayed to the upgrade after Fusaka, which does not have a consensus layer upgrade name yet. The execution layer name for the upgrade that will happen after Fusaka is called Amsterdam, and Tim said to pretty much appease the Verkle developers or the Verkle team, that he would open up a new meta EIP, basically a planning document for what code changes should go into Amsterdam, and Verkle is already considered for inclusion in the Amsterdam upgrade. So there you have it. Far more clarity, I would say, and less disagreement vocally shared on the call for ACDE 197. That's generally the scope of Pectra for now. That's the planned scope for Fusaka, and then also for Amsterdam. So there you have it. That is the state of affairs. And one of the conversations that I want to highlight that happened on the call that showed, it was a part of the call where there was so much unanimous support voiced by developers for this decision that I was a bit taken aback. Since the start of the Pectra planning process, it's been difficult, really, to get any decisions through about the upgrade, of course related to the scope, but even about the implementation design of certain EIPs. Lots of disagreement about how certain EIPs should be designed, like different ways in which it should work. And one of the conversations that developers had was around execution layer triggerable requests. So not only will it be possible for smart contract applications on Ethereum to trigger validator exits, but they'll also be able to trigger consolidations, and the execution layer will also do the verification for new validator deposits. Right now, actually, on Ethereum, because Pectra has not gone live, all of the new validator deposits go through a round of voting on the consensus layer side. This is for additional security. This was kind of a legacy mechanism that was included during the merge when Ethereum initially transitioned to a proof-of-stake blockchain. But now Ethereum is going to be is much more mature. It's has more economic security. It's starting to there's different kinds of cleanups that can happen to ensure that the consensus layer and the execution layer don't have redundancies in operations. So when it comes to validator deposits after Pectra, that validation to spin up new validators will primarily be handled by the execution layer, and the waiting time between a validator, between when a deposit is made to activate a new validator and when that validator goes live and on the consensus layer and actually starts to vote on blocks and starts to produce blocks, that in between period time will be shortened. So there's a variety of new functionalities that will be and new features that will be enabled on the execution layer. more responsibility, and hopefully we'll be able to enable more trustless designs for staking-related applications on Ethereum. And there was quite a few different proposals shared about how to simplify the way that these execution layer requests, these messages, are passed from the execution layer to the consensus layer. Because the consensus layer is really the layer that will do all of the parsing of these requests, understanding what type of request it is, what kind of actions it should enable on the consensus layer. Should a validator be withdrawn? Should a new validator be created, etc.? Whereas the execution layer really just needs to pass along these messages to the consensus layer and does not necessarily need to be doing any additional work related to these requests. And initially, like Client, a Gith developer, he proposed a solution for this. And then another Geth developer, I think he was a Geth developer, but his name was Felix. His name is Felix. And he shared another proposal on top of Light Clients, and it iterated on it, offered perhaps a little bit more simplified design. And on the latest call on ACDE 197, a new proposal was again shared to simplify execution layer triggerable requests. And this was proposed by Mikhail Kilinin. He's a Teku developer on the call. And he shared an updated proposal to make this process even simpler than it already was based on these iterations. And this proposal garnered support from not only Felix and Light Client, but it garnered support from so many other developers on the call: Prism developer POTUS, Teku developer Enrico, Reth developer Oliver, Lodestar developer Gajinder, Besu developer Daniel. The list goes on. All of these developers just voiced their support for the change, and it was a special kind of example of how developers were iterating on this idea. There was a problem. There was an unnecessary complexity in the way that these execution layer triggerable requests were being handled. And it was nice to see developers really agree and land on this solution. Some of the comments that were made about the latest design that Mikhail shared was that it's a quote-unquote great proposal. It simplifies, is one of the most simplest ways to go about implementing these execution layer triggerable requests. And while this does mean that several EIPs in Pectra will have to be updated, and some of the proposals that had been made to address this problem will be superseded, there's going to have to be updates made to the GitHub repositories that are listing out the specifications for Pectra. There was quite a bit of unanimous support to make sure that all of these updates happen quickly and in time for the launch of the next Pectra Devnet. We're going to talk about the timeline for the next Pectra Devnet, Devnet 4, but I want to highlight this very special moment of the call because it was rare. As I said, up until now, there's been a lot of disagreement related to Pectra, but the unanimous support of developers on the call that were saying this was a good design, and goes to show that the developers, many of the developers, I think, know what they're talking about, and they also can agree on a subject or a topic that is perhaps less based on the opinion of what Ethereum should be. Like the broader kind of big topics about Ethereum and its roadmap are, of course, still contentious and up for debate. But when it comes to very, very nitty-gritty technical decisions, and where really, there can be a lot of objectivity to what is really simple about the way that the code should work. I think it was nice to see developers land on a very elegant and simple design for execution layer triggerable requests. And I'm glad that they were able to reach that decision. They were able to find that, innovate and be able to find that solution and to see all of the support for it. So there you have it. Let's move on to now discussing where developers continue to disagree. And with that kind of happy little moment in the call, the rest of the call was back to discussing the Pectra split. And as we know from my last update, there was quite a bit of disagreement shared on ACDC 142. And now there's really not that much disagreement, I would say. There's really not up for discussion, and really there weren't very much pushback about Pectra being limited to the 8 EIPs on Pectra Devnet 3. But again, the big question is whether or not to include those 4 EIPs related to improving DA. And for people on our call, or people listening to this episode, I will have you know it's not frequent that the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik, himself joins these calls. But he joined this one, and he joined it to express how important that he felt it was for Pectra to include even a minor DA improvement. Until PeerDAS is ready, he said it's worth it to implement something related to data availability. And I would like to highlight his quote. Vitalik said, quote, "The reason why we need to think about this is because realistically, it's just clear that scaling actual usage is incredibly important. If Ethereum does not offer this, then people will find it elsewhere, and people are going to have an insecure blockchain experience that is not on Ethereum. I would even argue that even a 33% blob capacity increase is more valuable than 3 of the Pectra EIPs at this point. If you look at the ratio of efforts to value, the amount of actual value here is quite high in terms of increasing the amount of activity that can happen," end quote. So that part of the quote where he says, a blob capacity increase is even more important than 3 EIPs that are already in Pectra, just goes to show how much Vitalik does believe that Ethereum's future as a blockchain is dependent on rollups, is dependent on the user activity of rollups and making sure that rollups stay operational, that they're having a good business. Because making DA cheaper on Ethereum means higher margins for rollups. And we actually, I've said this on the show, highlighted this report before, but Galaxy Research has an excellent report that talks about the impacts of what cheaper DA does to the economics of Ethereum and the economics of rollups. Cheaper DA is excellent for rollups. They make more money on fees, on transactions, and they're able to reduce transaction fees for users. Not so great in the short term for Ethereum because it means less revenue from rollups, but it's all for the sake and the name of scalability to make sure that in the short term, when demand is not really there for all this additional block space, when demand comes, when all of the users start, there's like one killer app that every single user wants to use or draws in like millions of more people that had never heard about blockchain start using it, then, Ethereum and plus these rollups are able to take on this demand, have the structures, the infrastructure to be able to do it, to be able to facilitate all of that activity without fees going parabolically high. So that is really the vision that Vitalik is wanting to build for. There were other developers on the call, like Dancun Feist, who is an EF researcher, that also said he strongly supports the inclusion of these additional EIPs into Pectra. Others, however, were not so sure. Some of the developers were saying that they are concerned about the impact of increasing blobs on home stakers. Teku developer Enrico shared that he had one home staker kind of pop into the Teku Discord talking about how they missed a block. And to be clear, if you're chosen as a validator, you're randomly selected in the pool of validators to propose a block. That's when you get most of your rewards. I mean, it's a big deal to lose a block because, that's a lot of rewards at stake there. You get a bit of rewards when you're just voting and attesting to blocks, but when you get to propose a block, you get significantly more rewards for proposing. And Nixo, she shared on a prior Infinite Jungle episode that bandwidth requirements is really difficult as a home staker to keep up with. Ben Edgington, who had also been on the show, and he's a former Teku developer, also shared that since Dencun, it was the first time that he saw his home validator, his home staking node miss a block. So there was just some anecdotal evidence that certain home stakers are being booted off the network. And so developers were saying that before an increase to data availability, which would mean an increase to blob count, developers should do the due diligence to investigate how this would impact the decentralization of Ethereum, the decentralization of Ethereum's network of nodes. And you can see from this conversation that there is a tension between wanting to scale Ethereum, but at the same time retain Ethereum's decentralization, retain the ability, keep the barrier to entry very low for people to run a node and connect to Ethereum. So developers did decide, let's pursue a data-driven investigation of what it would take, what kind of impacts an increase to the blob capacity, what it would do to stakers. And because the changes that are being proposed to improve Ethereum's blob capacity are far simpler than peer-to-ask, which is an overhaul to the way that networking works on Ethereum. And developers will have more time to prepare peer-to-ask, which is now slated for Fusaka. Developers over the next month, Tim was saying, should pursue these data-driven investigations of what impacts this change will have on stakers. And in the meanwhile, actually, I'm gonna double back on this. But one thing that I want to highlight about Pectra Devnet 4. So right now it's Pectra Devnet 3. They're doing some debugging. There's some issues on Pectra Devnet 3 that developers are resolving. For Pectra Devnet 4, there's obviously some additional things that developers want to include, especially the proposal by Mikhail that I was talking about earlier in this episode. Pectra Devnet 4, developers are aiming to launch it within 2 weeks. So finalize all of the updates to EIPs and updates to any spec changes that they'd like to do over the next week. And then the week after that, by the next ACDE call, launch Pectra Devnet 4. So that's something to watch out for, to really see, is Pectra development happening on the timeline that developers say they want it to happen? They'd like to launch Pectra Devnet 4 within 2 weeks. And over the next month, finalize whether or not they want to include the 4 additional EIPs to Pectra related to DA. And if they do include those 4 EIPs, then there is a possibility that the time for mainnet activation for Pectra will be longer. So developers were targeting launching Pectra in February of next year. That's probably a bit of an ambitious target. I'm thinking more March or April of next year is more realistic. But just so you're aware, that's kind of the tentative timeline moving forward. Getting back into the discussion around home stakers and this tension between wanting to scale Ethereum but not hurt the decentralization of the network too much, some very quick notes about what exactly will change related to DA. There are 4 EIPs, as I said, related to DA. The first one is simply changing the blob count for Ethereum. Right now, there is a maximum of 6 blobs that can be attached to a block. That's basically space, block space that is reserved for arbitrary data and is priced differently from the rest of the transactions that are included in a block. They're often priced more cheaply. And the network prices these blobs dynamically so that on average there are 3 blobs per block. And the idea of an increase would be to, say, increase that target to, say, 4 blobs per block. So it's some kind of increase. And it really is just changing a variable, so it's not that complex. That's the first one. There's not really an EIP attached to it, but there will be. The second one is EIP.5762. This one is an increase to the minimum base fee per blob gas. This is to ensure that there is faster price discovery related to blobs. One of the things that you'll note in the Galaxy Research Report, which I will link, about the impacts of EIP 4844, the introduction of blobs to Ethereum, is that when there is high demand for blobs, the price for blob transactions goes parabolic. It moves so quickly from 0 to 100 that it can, create very high costs for rollups. So by increasing the minimum base fee, the idea is to ensure that those spikes happen perhaps more frequently and is not as 0 to 100, maybe, to be able to ensure that the demand for blobs is able to adjust more sensitively to demand. So that's the second one. EIP 7623, increase call data cost. Blobs are one area, one avenue, a new avenue where rollups can commit data to Ethereum. But the OG, the original way that rollups were trying to commit arbitrary data to Ethereum was through call data, the call data space in a transaction. And by increasing the cost there, developers can ensure that the size of blocks do not become too crazy. Call data is it continues to be one way in which rollups can commit data to Ethereum, but it is more expensive on average, more expensive, usually more expensive than blobs, than using blob transactions. But developers want to increase that cost so that you don't have the size of blocks is limited. The maximum size of blobs is limited. Blocks is limited. And this is, again, to ensure that there are no home stakers that are struggling to produce blocks and struggling to propagate blocks throughout the network that are just too large for them to handle. EIP 77042, uncoupled blob count between consensus layer and execution layer. Right now, the blob targets and maximums are set on the execution layer and the consensus layer, but developers would like it to be dynamically set by the consensus layer alone so that in the future, data availability improvements to Ethereum can really happen through consensus layer upgrades only. It doesn't require changes to the execution layer, so the uncoupling there is something that developers have been wanting to do for a while. I do think that the complexity of some of these EIPs are higher than others. For example, just changing the blob count target is going to be a lot easier for developers to do and to test because that's they're already starting the investigations for it, like I said, and the impacts for it this month. But when it comes to, say, EIP 7742, which is uncoupling the blob count between the consensus layer and the execution layer, that requires a bit more, I think it's a bit more complex, requires more changes to the protocol of Ethereum. And perhaps there's different design implementations that developers will go back and forth on. So those are the four that I did want to kind of specify so my listeners are aware of what exactly are we talking about when we say we're improving Ethereum's DA capability. And there are going to be data-driven investigations to make sure what the impact of increasing blob capacity will be to home stakers. A couple of takeaways I want to talk about related to the viability of home staking. Number one, this was mentioned by a base developer for the rollup base. His name is Francis. I mentioned it also on the last episode about ACDE 142. He mentioned that it's really important, or could be a really helpful or useful exercise to specify the minimum requirements for what it takes to spin up a node on Ethereum and to validate the Ethereum blockchain. I do think that this would be very useful. There's many different benchmarks that developers are using to decide, what is the average, what is the type of hardware and software and bandwidth requirements that an average home staker uses. But having the minimum requirements specified in some way, I think could be a very useful way to even track how those minimum requirements change over time. Through this data-driven investigation that happens, having those minimum requirements also be set and also be identified, I think would be very helpful. We know that it's no longer feasible to be able to run an Ethereum validator on a Raspberry Pi device. If that's not feasible, what is the average or what is the minimum requirement then? Is it the Rock B5 models? I truly know actually nothing about hardware, but these kinds of hardware specifications have been thrown around in the calls, and it's clear that there isn't consensus about what really is the minimum requirements. And given that they change over time, I think developers should have a clear baseline to aim for, and that is well known among the entire ecosystem. And the fact that every single year, the minimum requirements may change. That's something that home stakers should be aware of in advance. To know that as a home staker, I may have to upgrade my machines every single year. But maybe I don't. Maybe the way that the Ethereum protocol changes, those minimum requirements don't have to update that frequently. Only need to update every couple years. Maybe developers can really curate the upgrades and design the upgrades so that it fits and supports a minimum requirement, and they can do benchmarking analysis on those minimum requirements. I think just having those minimum requirements is something that developers should really aim to create through this data-driven investigations. I think that would be really important. And then finally, I just want to emphasize to our listeners why the heck it is so important for home stakers and home staking to remain viable. Right now, the majority of block production and block validation that happens, these validators on Ethereum that give security to Ethereum are run by regulated entities. They're run by these companies that make a business out of staking. And people delegate their ETH to these entities, these known entities that have business licenses, have names. It makes sense. There's a lot of benefits to doing that. It means you don't need to have the technical expertise to really stake your ETH. It means that you can benefit from additional features like liquid staking, having a liquid representation of your staked ETH. But in the case of certain governments that perhaps create laws and regulations that make staking unviable for these regulated entities. In the event of really any kind of unfortunate or adversarial environments, it's important to have a subset of Ethereum that is able to keep staking, keep validating, keep securing Ethereum that are not known, that are truly decentralized, that it remains viable for an individual to be able to go out, get the hardware that they need to secure Ethereum. As Ethereum evolves as a proof of stake blockchain, we're going to see a lot more specific initiatives to ensure that home stakers are fairly compensated for the work that they do. Although I'm not 100% sure exactly how the network would be able to differentiate between a home staking entity and a non-home staking entity. But this is definitely a concern that I've been hearing, not just from people of the Ethereum community, but just broadly in the crypto industry as well. We have an episode coming out tomorrow for the Infinite Jungle where I talk to Mirko from Staking Your Rewards, and he also mentions this as a very important cause, an important developing conversation in Ethereum that he's also watching out for. So there you have it, something to look forward to tomorrow when the new episode of Infinite Jungle comes out. I hope that you learn something new about Ethereum, as I always do on these shows. Thank you for tuning in. This was your update, your weekly update on what the heck's going on with Ethereum and the Pectra upgrade, which can be a little bit hard to follow along. But thank you, as always, for tuning into these shows, for listening to these episodes. I hope everybody has a great week in your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum. Stay safe out there.